Welcome to This Week in Morgan County. I'm your host, Russell Mokhiber. Our guest today is Davitt McAteer. Davitt is the author of a new book titled Monongah, The Tragic Story of the 1907 Monongah Mine Disaster. Davitt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russell.
You're a native West Virginian, born and raised, went to the University of West Virginia Law School. Give us a nutshell version of your professional history.
I went to WVU Law School, and during that period of time, the Farmington mine blew up in 1968. 78 miners were killed, and I reached out and contacted Ralph Nader and began a study which resulted in a report and a book about that disaster, which raised serious questions about the efforts in mine safety on the part of the federal and state governments and the union at the time in the company. Subsequent to that, I worked for Nader and then worked for the Center for Law and Social Policy and ran our own public interest law firm called the Occupational Safety and Health Law Center, and moved back to Shepherdstown to raise our children here.
You were also head of the Mine Safety and Health Administration for a number of years.
For 8 years, I did head up the Mine Safety and Health Administration during the Clinton years in office, and for 2 of those years acted as the acting solicitor of labor as well, and continue to work in the area of mine safety and health. During the last 5 years, Governor Manchin had asked me to do reports, blue ribbon committee reports on the Sago mine disaster, the Aracoma mine fire, and the Upper Big Branch mine disaster.
And Upper Big Branch took 29 lives. It was your report that sent Don Blankenship to jail. People say that. Is that true?
That has been said. Yeah.
What caused that disaster?
That disaster was caused by essentially violation of the most fundamental safety principles in mining from 100 years to today. Ventilation failures, water failures, failures to control the sparks, failures to control the dust that's created in a mine. And those were known quantities, known problems, and they just disregarded them.
Blankenship ran for Senate this year, and all over the state, he was taking out ads, he was speaking to reporters, saying, "You're wrong, it wasn't that." He was saying instead it was a gas leak.
That's correct. Blankenship has, since before the investigation started, just after the disaster occurred, come up with the theory that this was a massive infusion of natural gas or methane gas opening in the mine, and that caused the disaster, and that the other incidents, the other parts, were not relevant and were not the case. The difficulty with Blankenship's argument is that it's wrong scientifically. We have, over the past 100 years in this country and around the world, been able to look at mine disasters forensically and determine how they occurred, and by looking at the effect afterwards. In other words, we look at the size of the explosion, we look at the strength of the explosion, its spread outness, and we look at the type of explosion that it was. Methane explosions differ, for example, from coal dust explosions. And this explosion was initiated by a burst of methane along the face, and that we know that's going to occur, and we have precautions that can prevent it by ventilation, by water sprays. He failed to do those. Secondly, most notoriously, is that he failed to control the coal dust. The coal dust in the mine, when I went in, 5 weeks after the explosion, the coal dust had not been properly rock dusted throughout the mine, and from the entry all the way back to the face. And that speaks to the cause of the accident. The second is the fact that the explosion carried out through about 2.5 miles of a 7-mile mine underground, and that the carbonization, the burn, if you would, showed that it was coal dust and not methane and not gas, the kind of explosion it is. The explosions are different, and the coal is more powerful, to simplify the word, is more powerful than methane once it explodes, and that's spread out through the mine, and that's why we know that Blankenship's theory is absolutely wrong, and that the other scientific theory, and not just myself, but every study that looked at it, except for his, looked at it and came to the same conclusion that we did.
Just to go back to the first part of your answer, did you say that there was a methane explosion at Upper Big Branch?
There was a small methane explosion, yes. There was ignition of methane along the face. And that ignition of methane spread out into the entries. And in the entries is where the coal dust exploded, and that spread out then throughout the mine.
So there was an initial methane explosion, but had he taken the safety precautions that you're talking about in terms of taking control of the coal dust, there would not have been the loss of life?
That's correct. Or if it had been, there would have been a much smaller loss of life, 5 to 6 people. We know we're going to create methane in the mines. We know that methane is formed simultaneously with coal, and when you mine, it's going to come out. And so what we've done over the years, over the decades, is we've said, okay, how do we control that methane? The first is ventilation, i.e. blow it out, push it out. The second is use water sprays to knock the methane down or to knock down the ignition. We know we're going to have ignitions on longwalls, on continuous mining machines. That's going to occur. So having said that, we now have to take precautions to prevent those from spreading. And this is the whole philosophy behind mine safety, is contain the accident, contain the problem in its location, in its origin. He did not have sufficient ventilation. He did not have sufficient air coming across the face. Secondly, the water sprays were ineffective, and they were ineffective because he chose to use water from the Coal River. He brought it through a filter which jammed up, so then it was discarded. Now it comes to the face, and it's in the sprays, and it jams up because it's got silt from the riverbed. And the miners, knowing that he's watching the production every 30 minutes, core out the sprays, and the sprays then become inadequate and don't spray and knock the ignitions down, but in point of fact simply drill out. And that meant that they weren't getting the kind of prevention that we needed to have. Third, and most importantly, did not rock dust. Coal dust is, we know it's ignitable. That's what coal is. So in order to make it inert, in order to knock down explosions, you have to make it 65%, add 65% rock dust or ground up limestone. And it's typically done with machines that go along as you mine. You finish the mining process and you bring your rock dusters in the next day or next hour, and they spray dust around the walls and they inert the coal dust. So even if you have an explosion, it won't spread through the mine. He had 2 rock dusters that were inoperative. One had not been worked on since 1989, had not been repaired. He was asking 2 individuals in a mine at 7.5 miles of underground workings, 2 individuals to carry 40-pound rock dust bags and to distribute those by hand to keep up with 2 continuous mining sections as well as the longwall section. That's impossible. 2 fellows couldn't do that. 29
dead at Upper Big Branch. How many miners dead in the United States overall from that kind of disaster?
In the history of the mining in this country, which began in earnest in the late 1890s, probably 110, 120,000.
And what about miners dead from black lung disease? And tell us what black lung disease is.
Black lung disease is a disease that is peculiar to mining in that the inhalation of microscopic particles of coal dust, in effect, again oversimplifying, in effect get on the alveoli of your lungs and prevent the exchange of air. So you essentially die a slow death, unable to breathe. The estimate is, and it's simply an estimate, is probably in excess of 110,000 people who died from coal dust, from black lung. It is a horribly, horribly painful way to die.
This book that you've written on Monongah, I've asked people about it, and very few people know about what happened here. And this is the worst industrial accident in the United States. How many people died in this accident?
In excess of 500 people died in the accident. Just like other disasters in those periods of time, we didn't have an exact count. The company made a deliberate effort to move quickly. They were back in operation within 2 weeks. The interesting thing, or the ironic thing, is that the same problems that occurred at Upper Big Branch occurred in Monongah. Lack of ventilation, lack of adequate rock dusting, and water sprays, to use to inert the coal dust. So those three elements come back into play in 1907 when this occurs.
What triggered the explosion at Monongah? And Monongah, by the way, is a town near Fairmont, about 150 miles west of where we sit right now.
That's correct.
What triggered the explosion?
There are two theories of what triggered the explosion, and I ascribe to one, but the other has a merit too. First is they were pulling cars out of the mine, coal cars, to take to the tipple to be loaded to consent to the burning, and some of the 14 of those cars broke away and went back down into the mine. Well, that caused there was electricity in the mine. It was one of the newest innovations around the industry. They used electricity to power some of the mobile equipment. That caused a disruption of that electricity. The second and more plausible is that the mine was using shots to break the coal down. Simplify, you have a wall of coal, you drill 3 or 4 holes in it, you put black powder in there, you put a clay dummy to stop it from coming out, and you ignite that and knock the coal down, and it's loaded up and taken out. It's likely that one of those problems occurred because there was a great deal, a huge number of people in the mine, and two is that the scene of where we believe it happens is near where one of these shots was being fired. And the third part of that is that theory in effect blames the miner for not tamping the hole and not putting it in correctly. The miners had to pay for any of the tamping. The miners had to pay for any of the equipment and any of the dummies, the clay dummies that they had to put in. They had to buy them themselves. The company didn't provide those. So that being said, it's likely that occurred. Now, what caused this accident to double the number of people killed is that in violation of good safety principles and in violation of state laws, in virtually every mining state in the country at the time, mines were not to be connected underground. This mine was connected underground. There was a heavy wooden door which connected number 6 and number 8, and that door was obliterated at the time of the explosion. It was a huge, immense explosion. In fact, there were multiple explosions. And that caused it to go from 250 miners to be killed to about 500 miners killed.
Because the mines were connected.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
What made you want to write a book on this disaster? I mean, this was obviously the largest, but why this disaster?
Monongah was was a turning point, albeit a preliminary turning point, but a turning point in the area of occupational safety and health in this country. The companies and the industry had up to that time denied, first of all, that coal dust was explosive, denied that there was a need for government regulation, and denied any unionization efforts of any kind. So they basically had the roll of the day. They could make whatever decision they wanted to, and they got away with it. And the break was that at this time, this disaster was of such magnitude, and the time of its occurrence, December 6th, on the run-up to Christmas, it got tremendous amount of publicity throughout the country, and $156,000 was raised from the public for the widows and families because the company had no liability, and there was no workman's compensation, and there was no Social Security of any kind. So they were on their own. And so the public responded dramatically and sent money for these families. The second part that was interesting to me is that it was all immigrants, virtually all immigrants. They were the largest group were Italians, the second group were Polish, but they had a smattering there of some Irish, Greeks, African Americans, Tunisians. I mean, it just had a whole smattering. And it was a melting pot of people, and it was people who I grew up with. So the people that we go to Mass with are families that went to this, were in this disaster. The final thing was the response. What I found in studying this was the companies and the banks and others made determinations about who should get what money, who should get part of the money. This was controlled. The bank was controlled by the same coal company that the explosion occurred in. But that the widows, these young immigrant ladies, with children, and now, with the children without a father, really made lots of decisions on their own and really fought back. There was a rule that if you got to the money, you had to be proven that you could be responsible, and secondly, that if you weren't going to stay in this country, they would dole it out to you if you stayed in this country in small allotments, or if you wanted the whole allotment, you had to go back to your original country. And one of the women in this mine goes to the shipyard company, goes to the priest, goes to the shipyard company, and gets notes that says she's going to go back home to Poland. Her family remains in Fairmont to this day. And they're wonderful people, and it just has such a telling tale about the strength of these women and their power and willingness to take on the establishment and say, we're not going to do it this way.
You say towards the end of the book that Father's Day grew out of this incident. What's the evidence of that, and how did that happen?
It did, indeed, it did. The first church to celebrate Father's Day is a church in Fairmont, and that congregation, after the disaster, it occurred 2 years after the disaster, so that congregation made a commitment to say, we're going to have, since these people are without fathers, we're going to make a Father's Day commitment in remembrance of them. And there's historic evidence to that in the papers of that church.
We talked about liability. There was criminal prosecution. There was civil actions. What came of them?
There was, interesting enough, there were some criminal prosecutions and some civil actions. One of the co-owners of the company, and the company was connected to Consolidation Coal Company and also connected to the Rockefeller family. And one of the owners was a lawyer, a brilliant lawyer, A.B. Fleming, who was a judge at some later point. And Fleming was able to squelch he says in the correspondence between he and other lawyers that we can control the lawsuits in West Virginia. We can control them because, in essence, he's implying that we have enough political power, we have enough power on the street that we can squelch those. It's the ones in New York. There were suits brought by a family of a miner who was killed in New York City, and that's one of his grave concern was that particular was out of their control. So they hired a couple of New York firms, and they were able to block that and indeed settled that one for an amount that's undisclosed. For the criminal prosecution, they were able to wash it away. Remember, the state at the time, more so than today, but the state at the time had tremendous amount of power for the coal industry. They ran the government, they ran the courts, they ran the power companies, they ran the water systems, they owned all the homes, so that the individual didn't have much of an opportunity. When they had a grand jury, the grand jury debated and weighed this question and found no culpability on the part of the company.
Finally, Davitt, how far have we come since this disaster in terms of coal mine health and safety, and where are we now?
We've made tremendous progress since the time of that disaster. There's no question about that. We were killing 500 to 1,000 a year. In '68, when I began work on it, we were killing about 250 a year. Last year, we had some less than 15 deaths in the mines of this country. It's through mechanization, it's through the effect of the laws, both federal and state, and it's through a better management and more mechanization and removing people from harm's way. So we are, but the sad thing is that Upper Big Branch proves that we are not, nor will we ever be, in a position to say we can't have any of these disasters. We disregard at our own risk or at the risk of miners those fundamental principles, ventilation, rock dusting, sprays, water, all of those. When we disregard those, we put people at risk. And it's not the owners, it's the miners that are put at risk. And we have an epidemic, the reemergence of an epidemic of black lung in this country. And that's simply due to not paying attention and not fixing it.
Well, Davitt McAteer, thank you so much for joining us. The author of, once again, Monongah, the tragic story of the 1907 Monongah mine disaster. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching This Week in Morgan County.